Our next two speakers are from the Oak Park Public Library and the Field Museum. And I'd like to introduce first Naomi Priddy. She is the Multicultural Learning Librarian at the Oak Park Public Library, where she curates a book and artifact collection highlighting cultures around the world for an audience of students, families, and teachers. Before working at the Oak Park Public Library, Naomi taught elementary and middle school in Chicago and worked as a social studies instructional design specialist at the Field Museum, where she created curriculum and led teacher professional development. And also with Naomi is Heidi Rouleau. She is the School Learning Experiences Manager at the Field Museum. She spearheads the team responsible for designing, facilitating, and evaluating learning experiences for pre-K-12 school-based audiences, including students, teachers, and school administrators. Her prior experiences teaching diverse learners in both informal learning environments and traditional classroom settings deeply inform her work in this role. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in History and Theater from Millikan University and a master's degree in teaching and learning from DePaul University. Her core areas of interest include bridging experiences across learning environments and multi-dimensional museum-school partnerships aimed at sustainable impacts on teaching and learning in pre-K-12 settings. So please join me in welcoming Naomi and Heidi.
Hello everyone, thanks for having us today. So we're going to start by just doing a brief introduction and talk a little bit about what brought us here today. I'll let Naomi start with that since you're first.
Yeah, I'm first. So you heard a quick background, and part of that was that we come from two different institutions. I'm in a public library in the western suburbs, and Heidi is at the Field Museum in the heart of Chicago. And part of our presentation is going to be talking about the practices that we both use at our institutions with a learning audience, but it's also about how you can find resources to work across institutions. So I came to this work, started my career as an elementary and middle school teacher, and really was desperate for online resources like the ones we're talking about today. In fact, if I had gone to a workshop like the one today, I might still be in the classroom because this is exactly what I was looking for. I started trying to find things online and really just couldn't find things that I could use with my students. So that led me to go to library science school and study libraries and museums, mostly to figure out how I could get digital resources in the hands of teachers and students. And so that's part of what we're going to be talking about today.
And I'm Heidi Rouleau, and as Naomi mentioned, we came from kind of different backgrounds, but really approached things in an interestingly similar way. I actually did the opposite path, where I started in informal institutions. I worked at both historical sites and science museums, and then went actually into the classroom. I was a high school social studies teacher, so I was in the position that a lot of you, I think, in the room are today. And then found myself back in an informal institution, the Field Museum, working with social studies educators and science educators through the museum resources that we had. So we're going to jump in with learning through collections. So we've been talking a lot about how to learn from objects today, and I think there's going to be a lot of connections with what we heard from Matt this morning. But I want everyone to just think for a moment about what does it mean to learn from objects? What does the phrase object-based learning really mean? What does it entail? So take about 30 seconds to think to yourself about what that means, using experiences from your own classroom, using experiences from field trips, using your experiences from what you learned this morning during the sessions with the Met. And then I'm going to ask you to do a table talk around that. If you haven't already done so, you can turn to your table mates and start to talk about what does object-based learning mean. All right, we're going to come back together. Can I have some brave soul share a little bit about what your table talked about as far as what object-based learning means? I'm feeling brave a second.
I stayed up here.
I see a hand. Absolutely. Definitely. So we can look at objects, we can look at physical, we can look at photos, we can look at physical objects in our world. I love that you employed this idea of using our senses to explore that. We're going to explore that a little bit further later on. How many people had similar conversations at their table? Okay. Anything that someone is burning to add to that definition? So that's a really great point, that idea of digital versus physical objects, or even photographs versus physical objects, right? There's a different experience that happens between the two. And it doesn't necessarily mean that one isn't important or the other isn't important. Both have to exist and both serve purposes, but the experience is different when it's a tactile object versus when it's something that's two-dimensional in nature. Really good point. Definitely. So that authenticity is expanding accessibility, which is really wonderful, and I think that's going to be a theme throughout our talk today. So we have a really brief definition up here by two superstars in the museum education world, Falk and Deerking. The consequent learning and meaning making that develops from interacting with an object. So we're going to unpack this a little bit, both through some ideas that we're going to present to you, but also through some experiences that we're going to have you engage in today. So when we think about object-based learning, we like to think about it in terms of relearning how to read objects. Notice I said relearning, not learning for the first time. It's not really new. When we are babies, before we acquire language, we learn from the world using our senses. It's just naturally what we do. And those skills of perception are really very strong at that young age. But as we grow, we as a culture begin to emphasize skill in language and building that language skill up over perceptive skills. And so we see examples of this all the time. We see examples with the 2-year-old who can't stop asking questions, right? They ask, what is that? And what do we say? It's an apple. We name it, right? And once they have a name, once they have a word for that object, they move on to ask what the next thing is, instead of continuing to explore what that object is. That curiosity has been satisfied, and so they move on to the next thing. But if we challenge ourselves to dig a little bit deeper with our skills of perception, we begin to see that making simple observations, we can actually uncover a whole world of new information about that object and its place in the world just by digging deeper. And we do a really good job in the formal education world helping students to decode what different letters mean in a word and what different words mean in a sentence or a passage of text. But what we don't do all the time is help our students understand how different components of an object or different aspects of an object actually convey meaning as well. And so object-based learning and teaching students how to read objects is really all about that. And we think about learning to read objects or relearning to read objects, really, using our senses as being just as important as learning to read text passages. And it's really what the 150 scientists that work at the Field Museum on a large scale are doing on a daily basis. They're reading the objects in our collection to be able to make new knowledge and find new understandings about the world around us and the inhabitants of that world. So we think there's lots of benefits from a pedagogical perspective about object-based learning as well. So first, it grounds students in that authentic experience. So that word authenticity really rang true when you said that. So that authenticity is present when we think about learning from objects. It's an experience rather than just something that's passively taken in. Second, it lends itself really well to cooperative and collaborative learning. And third, it offers lots of different types of differentiation. So we can see language differentiation being present when object-based learning is happening, right? For those of you who might teach English language learners, object-based learning is a really great strategy for them. It offers reading level differentiation, offers knowledge level differentiation. In that cooperative learning setting, students can talk to one another and share their own personal experiences with those objects or with similar or comparable objects. It offers learning style differentiation, right? You can process verbally, you can process tactilely, you can process auditorily. And age differentiation as well. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Naomi.
Yeah, I think that age differentiation is key, right? We're talking about learning from a very basic level, pre-K, early childhood, before pre-K, of identifying and looking at and making meaning of objects. And we too, as adults, as professionals, can learn and make meaning from objects as you all did this morning. And there is a familiar language between museums, so you're going to see an activity that's pretty similar to what happened this morning, but we're going to push it a little bit further because this afternoon I want to really hone in rigor with object-based learning. So we're going to use the same practice that we were using this morning. I'm going to show you an object and I'm going to have you do thorough, in-depth observations. And I'm going to try to hold you back from making any inferences at all. A lot of times adults and older students want to jump directly into the inferences for a few reasons. First, they want to show their background knowledge, they want to share their expertise, and that's also sort of the way that we are programmed as learners to jump to the answer instead of slowing down through the process. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to challenge you to really slow down and enjoy the process so that we're not just naming objects like an apple, but we're really maybe noticing things that we might not otherwise notice. Don't feed your curiosity right away. After I ask you to do a lot of observations, we are going to make inferences, but we're going to make sure each of these inferences is tied directly to an observation. Similarly to wanting to jump to the conclusion, we don't always offer evidence when we're jumping to an answer. We are in a very information-rich world. We don't always ask each other to support our answers with evidence, and so making sure that every inference that we make is tied to an observation helps enforce the skill of tying every conclusion to observable evidence, which is very important in the scientific world. And then we're going to think about what additional questions can our observations and inferences launch. So, you guys are already pros at this. We're going to push it a little further. There's a handout in your folders on the right side that has these 3 stages. And once again, I'm going to ask you very clearly to only make observations. I'm going to show you an artifact from the Field Museum's collections. And I want you to fill the right or the left side of your sheet just with observations. Can someone really quickly give me an example of an observation? Maybe make an observation about the jacket I'm wearing. What's an observation about the jacket? It's blue, the color of it. It might be green actually. Like it's blue or green. So an observation, right, it's using your 5 senses. Color, material, texture. If it was a physical object, it might be a smell. Really go back to your basic, looking at the world skills, and don't jump to meaning making. Okay? If you guys try to give me some meaning, I'm going to push it back into I only want observations. So, this is my artifact, and I want to think about how we could learn from this artifact. I like this artifact because it makes me ask a lot of questions, but first, I'm going to just ask you again to make observations. You can write them down, we're going to work silently, and then we're going to pair up. Only what you can see and sense from this object. Alright, so I'm going to have you guys do a trial run at your tables. You're going to share your observations with each other at your tables. And I'm going to ask you to hold each other accountable. So if you hear any inferences, if you hear anyone trying to skip ahead and make meaning, push back and say, we're just doing observations now. Alright, so try it out and then you're going to share them with me after you talk at your tables. So I'm interested if anyone heard something from someone at their table that they actually didn't observe. So who heard something from someone at their table that they weren't able to observe or didn't get the chance to observe? All right, I'm going to start here. So what did you hear from someone at the table? Yeah, who, okay, what about the front? It's jagged. Okay, so there's a jagged texture in the front. Great, something about one part of the texture, it's jagged. Anyone else hear something from someone at their table that they didn't observe themselves at first? Yeah. Oh, interesting. So there's 2 observations here. One observation is, right, that there is, part of it is shaped like a pedestal. And there are 2 distinct pieces that are shaped differently, which led to a question of, is this all one thing or are they separate? Okay, great. Anyone else, an observation that they didn't pick up? Yeah. The soft round lines, the shape of the top part. Yeah.
Yeah, and keeping with the top part, my table mate, she noted that the top shape is tulip shaped, where in my observation, I said bowl shaped, and when she said tulip shaped, I looked at it, it envisioned tulips that I've seen before, so.
Great. What I like about this part of the activity, and thinking about what you all are sharing from what you learned from each other, is it shows, first of all, how much deeper in observation we can get if we really hold ourselves accountable to that. There's so much to be noticed about a relatively simple object that we can learn from each other. Does anyone want to add to observations, things they think might be important or that they noticed about this object? It doesn't have to be something you heard at the table. Any other observations? Yeah. So they look like they're leaves, they're shaped, different natural features, yeah, and the leaves look different from each other, so it's not all one type of leaf, yeah. Okay, so there's 3 leaves. It could be one plant connected with different features, or it could be different plants, yeah. Any other observations? It looks organic. You already commented on sort of the roundness and the shape, and I will say this is one piece. This is one piece altogether, including the base. So now, I'm going to have you return to your notes. If there was an observation that you just heard that you found really interesting, you're welcome to use that. But, or you can use an observation you already noted. I want you to circle one of the observations that you think is maybe the most interesting or the feature that you're most compelled by. And then I want you to start making meaning, making inferences, adding whatever background knowledge that you might have about what the plant is or about what the shape and design might mean. But again, it's going to be based on just 1 or 2 observations. So take an observation and then take a minute to make a couple inferences. All right, so let's share all together. What meaning can we make from this object based on our inferences? What are some of your ideas about what this could be or what it could mean? Yeah.
All right, so because of its lack of depth, it's kind of flat, I would think that it might be some type of storage or a vessel to be able to get just a small amount of some heavy spice. Because you don't need that much of it when you finish it.
Interesting.
Out of that.
I'm interested that you went directly to spice. That's really interesting, but I can see how the shape, right?
Yeah.
And the connection to other pieces, maybe of pottery that you might have in your own kitchen. You're making an inference based on what it looks like. That's great. I'm going to go.
You know what, just to piggyback on
Yeah.
this, I also thought it was for spices. And almost have pedestals for a dinner party when spices were very rare. So European, maybe Dutch, and maybe they could pass it around just a little bit.
Cool. And again, based on its shape, how it presents itself, right? There is a decorative element to the fact that it's a base and another shape. Yeah.
But just according to that, yes, the pedestal, so I believe that it's something important that they store it inside because it's elevated, so in the size of the table, the food that we have.
That's great. I love how you guys are all working together, even though you didn't talk to each other. That's fabulous. Just shared meaning making is beautiful. Anyone want to add or go in a new branch entirely?
I thought it was fragmented, a piece of a whole, maybe an artifact from an architectural structure found as a ruin.
Interesting. What made you think that?
Because it looks like the bottom is a marble heavy, so nobody's going to pick it up and pass it around.
Okay.
So it's probably a structure of some sort, building, and it looks very fragmented.
Right, so you're using that observation of like it's chipped in the front, and there's also the observation that could be made of, I told you that this is from the Field Museum. You might connect it, right, that it's, we have archaeological artifacts. But it's interesting how you notice the different density, and that shows how the meaning changes, right? Right, absolutely.
Yeah, I can imagine like having it at a party.
Right, it doesn't have like an elegant handle. Yeah, do you want to add to that?
Probably from a more advanced culture, it's more decorative rather than functional, and it's probably not in a Latin community because it's too heavy.
Okay, what observation tells you that it's more decorative than functional?
If it's just functional and a culture that doesn't have time and the luxury of painting things.
Right, the decoration itself. Right.
It has to be a higher level culture that has more artisans.
Mm-hmm.
And it's obviously pretty heavy. So it's not from a nomadic.
Right, it might not be too light to just carry around on a beast of burden. Yes.
One problem is that we don't know scale.
That's so true.
And just for the sake of pushing your points,
Please do.
I'm not a plant, but I look at that and I see a pillow.
Okay.
It reminds me of those, were they Chinese or Japanese, or the African wooden stands that people use as pillows, and that's exactly what I saw when I first laid eyes on it. I kind of doubt that's what it is, but the point is, there's a whole other interpretation that supports another set of, based on another set of knowledge I have.
Absolutely. That is such a good point. So there's one set of meaning making if this is something that's this big, right? Holding spices, something this big would make sense. There's another set of meaning for something about this big that could be a pillow. There's another set of meaning that could be about an object that's this big, right? It could be a chair or a seat. So all senses are important, and in fact, I'm gonna give it away. You're exactly right. This is a pillow. And it's bonus point. So I want to draw back to thinking about, I heard a lot of conversation about using images and using objects to launch inquiry. That's how I would actually use the next set of students asking questions. I wouldn't give away what it was. Students asking questions about what something might be to dive into inquiry to start a unit. But this is actually something that students can use as evidence. Yeah, it's a pillow. We have another example I'll show you in a minute. So thinking about all of the notes that you took on your paper, every observation and the way that you connected to inferences, this is evidence that your students could use in their writing. So in this way, they're using objects not just to get interested or to use it as an example, they're making meaning from objects, and so objects become primary sources. When I was teaching social studies, I was really fixating on getting documents for my students to use as primary sources and it all being written down. But this is a practice that you can use to build student skills in reading objects as primary sources and using them in meaning making about other cultures. Yes?
Sorry, I'm just going to go back. Hang on a minute. How would you sleep on that?
This is also
It is a pillow.
Yeah.
For what, a baby or a child?
Full-grown human being. Does anyone have any inferences on why pillows like this might be beneficial?
It's healthy for your back.
It's better for your back? What's what
bathhouses, they use them in bathhouses.
Bathhouses? Why did you think it was a pillow? What pillows had you seen before?
The wooden ones, and I have an association with Japanese culture, I think, protecting the hair, maybe.
And this is similar in Chinese culture. So these two are examples of pillows from China that were designed to protect women's hairstyles. Because the hairstyles are so elaborate, it would go below your head, not directly behind it. Right. Well, that's a whole. That's a new presentation.
So thank you for indulging us in that activity. We're going to have you engage in another activity now, but really putting on not your learner hat, but your teacher hat. So one of the beautiful things about object-based learning at this moment in time is that museums and libraries all across the country and across the world are really working hard to make their collections more accessible through digital technology, and also creating new interfaces to be able to have people who are not in the labs, who are not in the collection spaces, interact with them in really interesting ways. And we're hoping to take a look at an example of an exhibit that was totally digitized, meaning that every single object that's in that exhibit right now at the Field Museum, this year's Tang Hall of China, has been digitized, as well as all of the copy text. So all of the text that you would typically see on a wall in a museum exhibit We've actually created digital reading brailles in this particular exhibition. So all of the exhibition text, for the most part, is digital in nature, and that's been put into this online exhibition as well. So if you have a personal device, you can take that out. If not, please find a partner that you can look on with. And go ahead and navigate to chinahall.fieldmuseum.org. And we're going to give you a few minutes, probably about 10, to explore this online exhibition, all of the artifacts in that online exhibition, with your classroom instruction in mind. Then I'm going to ask you to think about how you might use one or two of those objects in a lesson. And we'll have a discussion around that. So take about 10 minutes to explore, and then we'll come back together.
And I'd like to note that of the objects that have been digitized, there's a few different types of digitization that you can see when you start to explore and click through the artifacts. There are photographs like the one I just showed you. There are also 360-degree views so that you can see different perspectives, different angles, as close as the physical object as we can get. You can see from different sides. And then there are also artifacts that have been, for lack of a better word, annotated. So objects where you can pick out different pieces specifically to make meaning. If you have any questions while you're perusing, or you want tips on the coolest objects in our opinions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll be walking around. We've spent a good amount of time with these resources.
All right, it sounds like conversations are kind of coming to a close. Are there any tables or brave individuals who would like to talk about ideas they have for how they might employ one or more objects from the online exhibition into a lesson in a classroom? Yeah, are there any objects that really stuck out to people as being particularly rich, or meaningful, or interesting? Yes?
It's not so much the objects, the text around them.
Sure.
I'm trying to make sense of the two together. So I kind of teach religious studies, and of course right now we're talking about Islam, and then the interest of Judaism and Christianity. We're asking why did Judaism as religious and religious?
And they were saying, essentially it's because of the diaspora and because of the United States, they're mostly, most of the people they know who are Jewish are Ashkenazi Jews, and so there's some documents, some papers here about Jews in China. And we were talking about how much people really assimilated in the places they went to, and so there's one that's talking about how, whereas in Judaism you are Jewish, essentially your mother is Jewish, and Islam is the opposite. In this case, out of deference, I guess they're saying culturally to the Chinese, they changed that demarcation, right? So that it came through your father's lineage, whether or not you identify as being Jewish. But I don't see any connection between that text and the object that's there, right? Like there's just an object about inscriptions on a synagogue and an image of a synagogue and how beliefs and images are fading as they're there. And another really interesting one about Jews taking haven in China during the Holocaust, and then how they subsequently left. So I mean, the text and everything together, but I'm not so sure how kids can draw that out from the image.
From the image itself. That makes a lot of sense. And that reminds me of sort of commenting about how the online exhibition is formed. You can see with each object, there's sort of three different storylines, three different ways of different interpretations of the artifact, and some of those things add additional artifacts, right? Either photographs or some other type of contextualization. I haven't looked at the exact artifact that you're talking about, but some of the images are really directly connected, and you can see how that meaning is made, and some are a little bit more abstract. And that actually makes me think of the wonderful activity you guys all did with the Met this morning about connecting multiple sources, and even thinking about how the curators of this exhibition sort of did that. They stuck with the artifacts that were in the exhibit, and then they also thought about like what other ways can we tell this story, not necessarily with objects because we have a limited space, but how can we take the online world to contextualize it differently?
And I think the inscription on the grave site is useful too, right? It was written in Mandarin and not in different languages, but not in Hebrew. So I mean, that in itself is really valuable.
And this also makes me think of, we talked about the limitations of of the digital space, right? We can't physically touch it. We might not get the best sense of scale. So there are definite limitations with digital artifacts, but then we can see sort of what the advantages that we have, which are like different ways to contextualize right at our fingertips. Yes, do you have a question or a comment?
I was commenting on, first of all, this is a beautiful exhibit. I just went through one of the exhibits. The one that I looked at was the diverse landscapes. And it shows all the different, like the different rivers, the Yangtze River and the Yellow River, how deep they are and how beautiful they are in different seasons. At the same time, how cold it is. So it's a good, for history, it's a very good lesson to show the diverseness of the vastness of China.
And that's
Good job.
That is, you picked out the main through line in the exhibition, which is really diversity and change in China. We think about it as kind of a monolith, and it really is a very diverse place geographically, culturally, and historically as well.
You mentioned the word abstract. So thinking about that, how would you apply music to an object tool? How would you do that?
That is such a great question, and I would answer that question by saying that music can be an object and can be a text in the same way.
And how are you going to abstract that concept from a experience?
From your, so it's a good, when we were developing this app, I was on the team that was working on this, and one of the conversations we had was how can we actually include music in this experience? And we weren't able to do that for a variety of reasons, but when you walk through the actual physical exhibition, there is music that's being played, but a lot of people think about it as background noise, and I would say that music and artifacts suffer some of the same fates in formal education in that they're often overlooked. We go directly to texts without saying what resources can we get from music and the sounds. As a non-musical theorist, I don't know exactly how I would pull meaning from music, but I would actually like to throw it out to if anyone else has any ideas how they use music in their classrooms. Do you have a comment on that? Or?
Yes, I am a 27-year veteran music teacher.
Wonderful. You're the expert in the area.
I'm 23. I'm away from the class. All right, so but I would imagine it to be very simple to do something like this, to probably let the students look at the artifacts and then branch their research off, depending on what music class you're in, branch their research off into what types of music were they performing during this time, what was going on, or in this part of the world, what are the very different types of instruments.
Yes.
Do they have rhythm? And then, so if so, how can we recreate that here in the classroom setting, something like that.
And I know there's so many amazing online resources where you can see musicians play, right? In the collection that I manage, I have a lot of musical instruments, and so much of the meaning that we make from it with students is having the instrument in their hands so they can feel it and see, do the observations, what's it made out of, but then also then watching someone play it who's from the culture where the instrument comes, so you can pull even more meaning. Yeah.
So I think one of the notable things that came up early on in our conversation around object-based learning is the idea that the experience with digital objects or with photograph of an object is different than the experience with a physical object. And what's really great is that in the Chicago metro area, we have an enormous resource, or an enormous set of resources to be able to bring real physical objects, tangible objects that are can be handled by students out to classrooms. And so I'm going to talk about one of them, and Naomi's going to talk about one of them as well. The N.W. Harris Learning Collection is a lending library of over 1,500 different specimens and artifacts that the Field Museum has that teachers can check out and bring back to their classroom for a month at a time. It represents the whole span of our our research and study. So we have anthropological collections, we have botanic collections, we have specimens that are geological in nature as well as zoological in nature. So I would imagine most folks in this room would be most interested in the people quadrant up there. But this is an enormous resource to be able to have those hands-on, tactile experiences with your students. We have two different types of objects that can be checked out. We have experience boxes, which are those hands-on boxes. I have an example up here that you're welcome to check out a little bit later. This one is Chinese Traditions that goes along with the China Hall resources that we're talking about today. And these have real specimens and artifacts in them that can be handled and looked at up close by students in your classroom. We also have exhibit cases, which are kind of mini dioramas, just like you would see in the museum, but they're shrunken down so that they can be portable and brought back to your classroom. One third type of object that we do lend out from the N.W. Harris Learning Collection, but there's only a few of them, are oversized collections. So those include a full-size, very large beaver, very, very large. You would really have to have a big SUV to be able to check him out, or her actually. We have a full-size replica T-Rex skull. So this is a cast of a specimen that's actually at Smithsonian. We call him Norm after Norman Wade Harris, who was the benefactor of the N.W. Harris Learning Collection. He makes a lot of appearances at science nights, science fairs, and things like that. It's pretty fun. And we also have a full-size tom turkey and a juvenile bald eagle. So these are actually tangible ways that you can bring real objects, real specimens into your classroom, and it's just at the Field Museum. I'm going to hand it over to Naomi, who's going to talk a little bit more about the collection that's at the Oak Park Public Library.
Yeah, so very similar to the Field Museum, but a bit smaller and more focused on cultures. The Oak Park Public Library has a collection of multicultural artifacts and books that I manage. And these are artifacts from all over the world that really range sort of across type. There's a lot of art, there are clothing, everyday objects, foodware, and it's all organized by continent. So you can browse our online catalog. I put the website up there, but again, these are things anyone with a Chicago or West Side suburb library card can check out of the library for free for a month. So again, objects that you can have in your hands, touch, feel, observe, and get the full sensory experience. And I think combining physical, tactile objects with digital collections is a way to really strengthen both ends. Any questions about these two collections before we move on? So we're now going to talk a little bit about sort of how and why, in addition to like the hard skills that your students are building, how it benefits learning, dig into a little bit more about how this actually builds our world to be a better place, because ultimately that's my goal as an educator. I want myself and my students to contribute to the world. And when I am teaching with artifacts, I like to think about how I could prepare my students, for example, someday to be an anthropologist at the Field Museum. So what are the skills that I'm giving my students to build them up to the place where they could make meaning from artifacts for a living? Because it's a pretty cool, fun job. So when I was at the Field Museum, I had a chance to talk to some of our anthropologists about the work that they do and why they do this work. And we're going to play a short video and use this video to sort of launch off the second half of our conversation about why objects help us build bridges between cultures.
I'm inspired by the creativity of people in the past and how ingenious they were, and I think that's something that we often miss in today's world. My name is Gary Feynman, and I am an archaeologist at the Field Museum in Chicago. I'm interested in why people cooperate, how they form large social and political groups, and how those groups fare over time. And I study that process both in Mexico and in China. I'm very fortunate that I can do archaeology with my wife, and we've worked together for a long time. We've walked more than 2,500 square kilometers. It's a good team effort and has worked out very well in both Mexico and China over about 40 years. We see people who can't pull together. We see people who are fighting each other. Why is that? Why is it that it's so hard to work for some kind of collective good? When people study the past, they basically have three kinds of ways of approaching it. One of which, most traditional, of course, is relying on written records. A lot of times, especially if that information is not heavily covered in documents, it could easily be lost. And so you're talking about people without history, and archaeology is a way to bring that history back to life. Archaeology, you have two ways of approaching. One is excavation, one is survey. Excavation is excellent for giving you detailed information about a fairly small area. Survey gives you that broader representation of how people settled in a region across a landscape and how that settlement history varied over time. And basically it involves walking systematically over a landscape, recording archaeological objects on the surface by using the archaeological record to tell us about some of those aspects of life. We're creating a much fuller story of people who left the earth without a written history. Shandong, China, where we've been surveying for over 20 years now, we've brought a whole new perspective on the area that was not available through the skimpy documentary records that existed prior to our work. I love all facets of my job. I love field work. I love the process of discovery. Whether it's on survey or excavation, you never know what you might recover in your next footstep or your next day, your next trowel that you move. I really should be thinking about stopping it because I have a lot to write up and I'm not a spring chicken. By having a deeper, more complete record of the past, hopefully that gives us greater insights about the present and how to shape the future.
Raise your hand if you now want to be an archaeologist. Definitely. So what did you take away from that video? Why, in addition to it being a great skill for students to learn and it being interesting for students, why does it really matter to learn from archaeology and artifacts? Yeah.
Well, you talked about cultures being lost because of limited records, but that doesn't mean that they're not significant or important to our own development. So it's sort of like you're playing like we've done in the past. We have today, for example, everyone was looking at several different kinds of documents, and you're sort of playing the role of detective and putting the pieces together with the limited resources that you have. So that's kind of what you're saying.
Absolutely. There's sort of two pieces that you just pulled out. The first one is letting cultures that maybe didn't leave behind a written record, allowing them to speak and share their meaning with our classrooms. And then there's also sort of the skills and practices of uncovering and discovering that's part of the journey of archaeology. Does anyone want to add to that? Yeah.
You were the interested sponsored the Project Archaeology December. That was part of that program.
Awesome.
And it talks about shelter and other aspects of archaeology. So a little bit of tie-in with that.
That's great. That's a really good resource. Yeah. Yeah.
It's an excellent tool to approach multicultural learning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We know that everyone learns differently and makes meaning differently, and this is a great way to do it. Do you want to add to that? Okay. Yeah, Meg.
I think as a teacher, I can't reconcile
providing these objects with cognitive learning, conceptual learning. And when you're a teacher, there's so much stuff. And I love knowledge, crazy about all kinds of knowledge. But there's a limit to what a teacher can teach. And that's the real problem when the teachers select their curriculum. In Chicago, when you use the core curriculum, you have to go for the concepts, the most important things of everything. And so minutia doesn't count. It's nice to have it if you can use the concept first, basically, and then go in from the concept to the pieces. And I think that's something that the museums in Chicago ignore. And it's dangerous, because we can't deal with the museums if they won't go with our curriculum.
I hear that. We have a few examples of some curriculum that we've aligned specifically to Chicago, but then also with national places. But I would also sort of, I hear you, but I would add that objects have a way of teaching more than one thing at a time. So if we're strategic with the way that we use objects, we can actually use them to bring in depth and reflect the curriculums that we're required to teach. We'll show you an example of that in a few minutes. And they are ways to really cover the same material in a way that's engaging. So I don't see it as an either or, I see it as a strategic integration of both. You know, Heidi and I both came to Museum World from classrooms, so we really think about the realities of what it's like in the K-12 classroom and bring that to our
Well,
work.
I think it's up to the museum to come up with the concepts so that we can look into them easily. We don't have enough time to do that conceptual digging ourselves.
Absolutely, and that's why,
At the museum level, we can cope with it.
Here, I hear you so clearly, and you're exactly describing the journey that I went on, right? I was spending so much time trying to find resources, which is why I came to the museum and libraries to try to get resources more accessible. And we're going to show some resources in just a few minutes. Yeah.
And thank you for consenting to show us some resources. I'm right there with you. There is, this whole thing about the word relevance as it relates to our most of our classrooms across this city, and it's one of the things that I've kind of found it difficult to even find with respect to the students in our African American communities. So that if there's something, and probably one of the reasons that I haven't done a lot of work or taken a lot of kids to the Field Museum as much as I've taken them over here to DuSable is because of that relevance. So I'd like to see, something, to be addressed in a very significant way.
Great, thank you. And that actually connects directly to some of the resources that we are going to share, because we know, especially in a city like Chicago that is very diverse but also very segregated, students don't necessarily see themselves reflected in their curriculum, and because of that, they aren't always able to see other cultures reflected too. And I think there's a few pieces. So we're going to talk about sort of contemporarily, culturally relevant pedagogy in just a minute, but I also want to talk about anthropologically, like historically, culturally relevant material, just to close this out. So one thing I would say that Gary pointed out that I found really profound when I was talking to him is this piece of being able to share meaning from civilizations that didn't use it or leave a written record. We've all heard the phrase that history is written by the victor, and archaeology is not always that way, right? So we can hear from civilizations that didn't get the chance, or for whatever reason didn't leave the same type of record that we're used to using. The other way that it's able to connect is through sort of the broad anthropological approach that the Field Museum takes, which is the way of describing culture, really, which is valid expressions of the human experience. So at the Field Museum, in the anthropology department, they talk about how every culture is a product of the common concerns that humans experience and how they address them through different means. Common concerns, different approaches. So human beings share the same concerns. You mentioned some of them from archaeology: shelter, community, food. We share these things, and so anthropology can be a way to connect people, but then also explore diversity through the different approaches that people take. The other thing is, as you were saying with English language learners, is that artifacts really allow us to defy language barriers in our own physical spaces. So in our classrooms, students can engage directly with objects, no matter what language they speak. But then also students can engage with cultures, whether or not they speak the language that the culture speaks. Want to answer? That was a lot. So now to your other question. In the multicultural collection that I curate, one of my big emphases is making sure that the community around us is also reflected. So I have 3 main goals when I do multicultural learning, which are up on the board. The first one is exploration, which is sort of what we've all been talking about today. Really, that is looking at other cultures, learning, exploring new spaces, and seeing different life ways. And the second piece is identity. And this is something we don't always see in multicultural learning. We see a lot of looking sort of outside to other cultures, but not necessarily understanding our own identities and how our identities influence the way that we look at other cultures. So a big part of taking time to look at other cultures really is allowing students to understand their own culture and make meaning of their culture in similar ways that they're making meaning of other cultures. If you stick with just the exploration, 1, it might not be relevant to students, but 2, it can tend to kind of otherize a community. So you're talking about another culture as if it's only behind the glass of a museum and not as though it's a living and vibrant culture today. And then you're also distancing students from other cultures just by looking outside. It can be a little voyeuristic. But if students also have the opportunity to reflect on their own culture in the classroom through some of the same lenses, that is able to make the bridge and build empathy, really, which is my ultimate goal, which is having, giving cultures the ability, individuals, to see other cultures in their own terms. So not just an other group, but how is that culture related to me and my identity, and how can we find commonalities and make understanding together. And this is going to be reflected a little bit more in the resource that Heidi shares with you.
So, as Naomi mentioned, we're going to share some resources with you. Along with the launch of the Sears Tang Hall of China, the exhibition, we launched the online exhibition, and also a toolkit of different resources, including lessons that are aligned to local curriculum as well as national standards, as well as other multimedia resources both in English and in Spanish that are available for educators to use as they're teaching about history and cultures of China. And one of the unique aspects of the Educator toolkit is that it employs 3 different empathic lenses. So empathy is something that we hear a lot about today, both in the classroom, thinking about social emotional learning in our own practice, but we also hear it a lot in just our culture. We're thinking about how do we build more empathic people, and how do we work to foster empathy. And so these 3 empathic lenses are really not just meant to be kind of the soft skills, right? We tend to think about social emotional learning being separate from academic learning. But in this instance, it's really necessary for academic learning. So throughout these resources, we built 3 different empathic lenses. Historical empathy, so that's thinking about how do I take the perspective of and understand, build a real understanding of peoples of the past. Cultural empathy, so how do I do perspective taking or try to walk a mile in the shoes of peoples of other cultures? And then finally, social empathy, so how do I work collaboratively and cooperatively with other people, my peers, in my own classroom, to be able to, even when I disagree with someone in my classroom, be able to really work hard at understanding what that perspective is. So each of you has a resource that we have included in the packet, in the folder. There's one in English and one in Spanish. You can select the one that is your language of choice. And we're going to take a close look at this particular resource. So this is one of the lessons that's in that China Educator toolkit called The Outsiders Inside. And the compelling question that really drives this investigation forward is, what does it mean to belong to a community? So we really wanted to take with this particular lesson, and really with all the lessons in the China toolkit, that relevant approach to be able to say not only how do we understand peoples in the past in China, but how do we understand that in current culture in China or cultures in China, and how do we understand that within the context of our own lives? How do we make that relevant to our experiences, our lived experiences? And so what I'd like everyone to do is take a few minutes to independently read through the lesson. And at each stage along the road as you're reading, when you find examples of historical empathy being employed, just jot a little H next to that. When you find examples of cultural empathy being employed, put a little C next to that. And any examples of social empathy, so that peer-to-peer empathy, that understanding and perspective taking of others in class, put a little S next to that. And then we're going to use that in a discussion at the table.
To answer the question directly about curriculum, so each of the resources is aligned, both internally and then we have a specific, where is it in the bottom? Connection to the updated social studies standards in Illinois, so you can find the tie-ins with your curriculum. And if you have any other questions, please let us know.
All right, I'm going to ask you at your tables now, with what you've been able to read through at this point, to have a discussion about what examples you found of the three empathic lenses being employed, and then also what other opportunities you see for developing a sense of historical, cultural, or social empathy within your students in the classroom. So what are those other opportunities, either in a unit of study around China, or perhaps another unit of study in your classroom? By just having you leave with two brief questions. We've shared a lot of resources with you today that you can tap into at the Field Museum or the Oak Park Public Library or the public library in your community, or many of the other cultural assets that exist in your community. So we just wanted to leave you with two parting questions to think about as we wrap up this session and the day, because I think we've gotten a lot of this today. Think about what cultural assets exist in your school's community. Maybe they're cultural assets that have gone untapped in your school previously. And think about what action step you can take to leverage those cultural assets for learning in your classroom. Many of them exist and are ready and willing to really come into your classroom and breathe new life and bring really interesting perspectives. So thank you all for sharing on this journey with us today. We really appreciate it. Naomi and I will both be around for questions. We have some of the artifacts from the Chinese Traditions Harris Learning Collection box if anyone wants to take a look at it. I also have some of the bookmarks that have a link to the catalog online as well if you're interested.